The Miami sun had barely begun its descent when Zander Montes felt the first twist of panic in his gut. His brother Mateo's breathing had changed from the usual wheeze he'd learned to monitor to something that sounded like drowning on dry land. Each inhale scraped against his throat with a sound that made Zander's small hands shake as he pressed them against his chest, feeling how his ribs worked too hard, how his body fought for oxygen that wouldn't come. He was 7 years old, and he knew what this meant. The studio apartment they shared with their mother felt impossibly small in that moment, walls closing in as Mateo's lips started turning blue at the edges. His inhaler lay empty on the floor where he'd dropped it after the third useless attempt to pull medicine from a canister that had run out 2 days ago. Their mother had promised to refill it after her shift at the hotel, but that shift had started at 6 in the morning and wouldn't end until midnight, and Mateo didn't have hours to wait. Zander's fingers found his brother's hand, squeezing with desperation that felt too large for his small body. His eyes had gone glassy, unfocused, and the terrifying rattle in his chest made him want to scream. But screaming wouldn't help. Screaming wouldn't bring air into lungs that were closing up like fists. He'd called their mother's phone 17 times. He knew because he'd counted each ring before voicemail swallowed the sound. The hotel didn't let housekeepers answer personal calls during their shifts, a rule that made perfect sense until your brother was dying on a mattress on the floor and you needed your mama more than you'd ever needed anything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The apartment around them told the story of their lives in small, careful details. A calendar on the wall marked with stars on the days when Mama got paid, circles around the dates when bills were due. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs that Mateo had found at a garage sale and carried home on his back, determined to give their mother somewhere proper to sit when she came home exhausted from cleaning other people's homes. The walls were covered with Zander's drawings, crayon pictures of families holding hands, houses with big yards, dogs and cats that existed only in his imagination because the landlord didn't allow pets and they couldn't afford one anyway. Zander had learned to read his brother's breathing the way other kids learned to read books. He knew the difference between the morning wheeze that meant Mateo needed his inhaler and the afternoon tightness that meant he'd been playing too hard at school. He knew the sound of the bad attacks, the ones that sent them to the emergency room where doctors asked questions about medication compliance and follow-up appointments that their mother answered with the kind of tired honesty that came from doing her best in a system designed to punish poverty. This was worse than any attack Zander had witnessed before. The decision formed in Zander's mind with clarity that shouldn't have been possible for someone who still believed in tooth fairies and thought clouds were made of cotton candy. He couldn't wait for adults to fix this. He had to become the adult, even if his legs barely reached the pedals on his bicycle and he'd never crossed a street without holding someone's hand. He pulled on his blue sneakers with the lights in the heels, the ones that blinked with every step and made him feel brave when the world got scary. Mateo had bought them for his birthday last year, saving money from the part-time job he wasn't technically old enough to have but that the corner store owner gave him anyway because he felt sorry for their mother. Mateo needed a hospital, needed doctors with real medicine and inhalers that actually worked, and Zander knew exactly where the hospital was because they'd taken the bus there 3 months ago when Mateo's last attack had gotten bad enough that even their mother's careful rationing of emergency room visits couldn't justify waiting any longer. The hospital was 7 blocks away. He'd counted them from the bus window, memorizing landmarks the way some kids memorized cartoon characters. 7 blocks through Miami streets where cars moved like angry metal rivers and strangers didn't stop to help little boys who looked lost. Zander knelt beside Mateo one more time, pressing his forehead against his. His skin burned with the fever that always came with the bad attacks, and his chest barely moved now, each breath shallow and insufficient. "I'm going to get help," he whispered, his voice cracking despite his attempt at bravery. "You stay here and keep breathing, okay? Just keep breathing until I come back with doctors." He didn't know if he heard him. His eyes had closed, and the sound coming from his throat had quieted into something worse than the rattling, a thin whistle that meant his airway was almost completely blocked. Zander grabbed the stuffed bear that sat on Mateo's pillow, the one their father had given him before he left. He tucked it under Mateo's arm, even though his brother was unconscious and probably couldn't feel it. "Mr. Bear will keep you company," Zander said, his voice trembling. "He'll make sure you're not alone." The door to their apartment stuck like it always did, swollen from humidity and neglect, and Zander had to throw his small body against it twice before it opened. The hallway outside smelled like mildew and the kind of cooking that happened when people stretched food stamps across 30 days with nothing left over for luxuries like variety or freshness. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B was standing in her doorway, a cigarette dangling from her lips as she watched the evening news blaring from her television. "Zander," she called out as he rushed past. "Where you going so fast, mijo?" Hospital, he shouted back, not stopping because every second mattered and he couldn't explain the whole situation when Mateo was dying upstairs. He ran. His light-up sneakers flashed blue and white against cracked linoleum as he raced down 3 flights of stairs that seemed steeper than they ever had before, his small hands gripping the railing that wobbled under his touch. The building's front door opened onto a street that roared with afternoon traffic, and Zander felt his courage waver for the first time since he'd made his decision. Cars streamed past in endless procession, their horns creating a symphony of impatience and anger. The sidewalk was crowded with people heading home from work, briefcases and shopping bags creating obstacles that Zander had to navigate around. A street vendor was selling mangoes cut into flower shapes, the sweet smell mixing with exhaust fumes and the particular scent of Miami in summer, salt air and heat and humanity all compressed into air thick enough to taste. But Mateo's blue lips flashed in his memory, and he stepped onto the sidewalk. Miami's little Havana neighborhood pulsed with life that paid no attention to one small boy moving with desperate purpose. Vendors sold fruit from carts painted in colors that would have been beautiful if Zander had any attention to spare for beauty. Music poured from open windows, salsa competing with reggaeton competing with the baseball game someone was listening to on an old radio, creating chaos that matched the panic hammering in his chest. People walked past him without seeing, absorbed in their own lives, their own problems, their own emergencies that didn't include a 7-year-old running toward hope he wasn't sure existed. An old man sat on a folding chair outside a domino hall, watching the street with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He looked at Zander as he ran past, seemed to register the panic on his face, but didn't move to help. In this neighborhood, people had learned to mind their own business, to not get involved in situations that might bring trouble to their own doorsteps. The first intersection loomed like a monster. Cars streamed past in both directions, a river of metal and exhaust that moved too fast for small legs to navigate safely. Zander waited for a gap that seemed big enough, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He thought about Mateo, about how his brother had taught him to look both ways, to wait for the walk signal, to always be careful because the streets didn't care how small you were or how urgent your reasons for crossing might be. But there was no walk signal, and waiting felt impossible when every second meant Mateo was getting worse. Zander darted across with his heart in his throat, horns blaring behind him as a taxi swerved to avoid his small body. The driver leaned out his window, shouting words in Spanish that Zander was too young to understand but old enough to know weren't nice. He didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running because stopping meant thinking about how close he'd come to being hit and thinking about that would make him too scared to keep going. He kept running. Sweat plastered his dark hair against his forehead despite the red baseball cap he'd put on that morning when the world had still been normal. It was Mateo's cap really, too big for Zander's head but special because his brother had let him borrow it. His lungs burned with effort, and he wondered distantly if this was what Mateo felt like all the time, this sensation of not getting enough air no matter how hard you tried to breathe. The second block passed in a blur of storefronts and strangers. A bodega with mangoes and plantains stacked in pyramids outside. A botanica with candles in the window and statues of saints that were supposed to grant miracles. A laundromat where women folded clothes and chatted, their laughter spilling onto the street. Zander ran past all of it, his world narrowed to the simple equation of distance and time and his brother's life hanging in the balance. The third block brought a park where kids played on swings that squeaked with rust, and Zander felt tears start falling because Mateo loved swings, loved the feeling of flying that he never got to experience because asthma kept his feet on the ground more often than in the air. There was a basketball court where teenagers were playing a pickup game, their shouts and laughter a reminder that somewhere in this city, people were having normal afternoons where brothers weren't dying and 7-year-olds weren't running through traffic trying to be heroes. A ball bounced into Zander's path and he jumped over it without breaking stride, ignoring the kid who yelled, "Hey!" after him. There was no time to stop, no time for anything except getting to the hospital before it was too late. By the fourth block, his legs felt like they might give out. 7-year-olds weren't built for marathon sprints through urban chaos, and Zander's small body was beginning to understand its limitations even as his will refused to acknowledge them. His side ached with a stitch that felt like someone was stabbing him with every breath. His sneakers, which had seemed so magical when they were new, now felt heavy on his feet, the battery-powered lights draining what little energy he had left. But he couldn't stop, couldn't give up. Because Mateo had never given up on him, had always been there when Zander needed help with homework or protection from bullies or just someone to talk to when the world felt too big and scary. Brothers didn't abandon each other, and Zander wasn't going to be the kind of brother who quit when things got hard. He pushed through the pain, forcing his legs to keep moving even when they screamed for rest. The fifth block brought a small grocery store where Mama sometimes shopped when they had a little extra money. The owner, Mr. Garcia, was outside sweeping the sidewalk. He looked up as Zander ran past, concern crossing his weathered face. "Zander? What's wrong?" he called out. "Mateo, hospital, can't breathe," Zander gasped out, not slowing down because explaining would take time he didn't have. Mr. Garcia's expression shifted from concern to alarm, and Zander heard him say something to someone inside the store, but he was already past, already focused on the next block and the next and the one after that until he reached the hospital that represented the only hope he had. The traffic light ahead had just turned red when he reached the fifth block's intersection, and Zander saw his chance. He ran into the crosswalk with single-minded determination, focused entirely on reaching the other side where the hospital waited with its promise of help and healing. He didn't see the black Mercedes until it was almost too late. The car appeared from his left, running the red light with the kind of aggressive entitlement that expensive vehicles often carried through intersections where rules applied to everyone else. Zander froze in the middle of the street, small body locked in terror as tons of metal bore down on him with speed that would kill on impact. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. Zander could see the driver's face through the windshield, watched his eyes widen with horror, saw his mouth open in what was probably a curse or a prayer or both. He thought about Mateo, about how his brother would be alone when he died because Zander had been too slow, too small, too stupid to even make it across the street without getting killed. The Mercedes's brakes screamed. Tires left black marks on asphalt as the driver fought physics and momentum, and Zander closed his eyes because he couldn't watch his own death approaching. He thought about his mother, about how she'd lose both her sons on the same day, about how that would break something in her that could never be fixed. The car stopped 3 inches from his knees. Zander opened his eyes slowly, not quite believing he was still alive. The front bumper of the Mercedes was so close he could have reached out and touched it. His legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there in the middle of the street. But then he remembered why he was running, and panic overwhelmed the fear. Harold Ranger's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his heart hammering with adrenaline that came from nearly killing a child in broad daylight on a Miami street where witnesses would remember his face and his license plate. He'd been distracted by a phone call about shipments arriving at the port, his attention split between business that couldn't wait and driving that apparently needed more focus than he'd been giving it. The little boy stood frozen in front of his car, his chest heaving with exertion that had nothing to do with their near collision. He wore a faded superhero t-shirt, Spider-Man, Harold thought, though he'd never paid much attention to comic book characters. That had been nice once but now bore the telltale signs of careful washing that couldn't quite remove all the stains. The knees of his jeans were worn through, patched with iron-on transfers that were starting to peel at the edges. His light-up sneakers flashed frantically as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, and the baseball cap on his head was at least 2 sizes too large, sliding down over his eyes. Harold started to roll down his window to apologize, to check if he was okay, to do whatever damage control was necessary when you almost turned a child into a tragedy. But before he could speak, the boy moved. He ran to his driver's side door with desperate speed, his small fists pounding against the window with force that suggested terror rather than anger. His mouth was moving, words tumbling out too fast for him to understand through the glass, and tears streamed down his face with the kind of genuine anguish that couldn't be faked. His eyes were wide with panic, red from crying, and Harold could see the desperation in every line of his small body. Harold's instincts screamed warnings. This could be a setup, some elaborate scheme to get him out of his vehicle in a neighborhood where his presence wasn't exactly welcome despite the legitimate businesses he operated as fronts for operations that were decidedly less legal. He'd survived 15 years in Miami's criminal underworld by trusting his paranoia more than his compassion. Children had been used as bait before, he'd seen it happen, had even heard stories about organizations that trained kids to create exactly this kind of scenario. But the boy's face pressed against his window, and something in his expression cut through every defensive calculation he'd spent years perfecting. This wasn't the calculated desperation of a child playing a role. This was real terror, real anguish, the kind of pure fear that children only showed when the worst thing they could imagine was actually happening. He opened the door. "Sir, my brother stopped breathing," Zander said, the words exploding from him with relief that an adult was finally listening. "He has asthma and his inhaler is empty and he turned blue and I ran to get help but the hospital is still 2 more blocks and I don't know if he can wait that long and please, you have to help me." The desperation in his voice was so pure, so completely authentic, that Harold felt something twist in his chest that he'd thought had calcified beyond the possibility of such reactions. He was 34 years old, had built an empire on the principle that emotion was weakness waiting to be exploited, and this 7-year-old had just shattered his carefully maintained detachment in approximately 30 seconds. Harold studied the boy's face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. But all he saw was a terrified child who'd run through traffic trying to save his brother, whose small hands were scratched and bleeding from pounding on the car window, whose face was streaked with tears and sweat and the kind of desperate hope that came from finding help when you'd almost given up. "Where is your brother?" The question emerged rougher than intended, years of cultivated menace making even genuine concern sound like threat. Zander pointed back the way he'd come, his small arm trembling with exhaustion and fear.
"Our apartment. 4 blocks that way."
"He's on the floor and he can't breathe right and Mama's at work and won't answer her phone and I didn't know what else to do so I started running to the hospital but it's so far and is getting worse and I'm scared he's going to die before I can get help." The words tumbled out in a rush, each sentence running into the next without pause for breath. Zander's chest was heaving from the running and the crying and the terror that had been building for who knows how long as he watched his brother's condition deteriorate. Harold's mind calculated rapidly. 4 blocks to an apartment, child in respiratory distress, mother unreachable. Taking the boy back to his brother was faster than calling an ambulance and waiting for it to navigate Miami traffic. He could have him there in 3 minutes if he drove with the same aggressive disregard for traffic laws that had nearly killed him. But bringing a stranger's child into his car, driving to a location where a medical emergency was in progress, these were complications that could expose him to scrutiny he couldn't afford. If something went wrong, if the brother died despite his intervention, there would be questions. Police reports. His name in official documents. Connections drawn between his legitimate businesses and the less savory aspects of his empire. Then Zander grabbed his hand, small fingers wrapping around his with desperate strength. "Please," the boy whispered, and Harold saw his own reflection in those terrified eyes, saw what he might have been decades ago if circumstances had been different, if he'd been the one with a sick sibling and no one to help. The calculation shifted. The risk assessment changed. None of it mattered compared to the simple fact that this child needed help and Harold was the only one available to give it. "Get in," he said, already reaching across to open the passenger door. Zander didn't hesitate. He scrambled into the Mercedes with the kind of trust that should have been impossible after nearly being run over, but desperation had a way of overriding survival instincts that usually kept children wary of strangers. He climbed into the seat and immediately tried to reach for the door handle, ready to direct Harold back to the apartment, his small body vibrating with urgency. The leather seat swallowed his small frame, making him look even younger than his 7 years. His feet dangled above the floor mat, unable to reach the ground, and his hands left small, dirty prints on the expensive leather. Harold found himself not caring about the mess, about the damage, about any of the material concerns that usually occupied his attention. "Put on your seatbelt," he said, the command automatic despite the urgency of the situation. Zander fumbled with the belt, his small hands shaking too badly to manage the mechanism. His fingers kept slipping off the metal buckle, and frustrated tears welled up in his eyes as precious seconds ticked away. Harold found himself reaching over to help, his fingers brushing against his as he clicked the buckle into place. His hands were ice-cold despite the Miami heat, shock setting in now that he'd found help and could afford to let his body acknowledge the trauma of the past 30 minutes. "What's your name?" Harold asked as he threw the car into drive, his foot already pressing the accelerator with force that made the engine roar. The Mercedes shot forward, tires squealing against the pavement as Harold executed a U-turn that would have earned him a ticket if any police had been watching. "Zander," he whispered, his eyes locked on the street ahead as if his focus could make them arrive faster.
"Zander Montes. And my brother is Mateo.
He's 10 and he's really nice and he helps me with my homework even when he doesn't feel good and he can't die because Mama would be too sad and I would be too sad and please drive faster." The raw honesty of his plea gutted Harold in ways he didn't have time to examine. He was already driving faster than was safe, weaving through traffic with precision born from years of navigating these streets during operations that required speed and discretion in equal measure. Other drivers honked and swerved, but Harold ignored them, his attention focused entirely on getting this child back to his brother before the worst happened. "Tell me about his symptoms," Harold said, his mind already categorizing the medical emergency with clinical detachment that came from having dealt with injuries and illness in contexts where hospitals asked too many questions. "When did the breathing problems start?" "This morning it was just wheezing like normal," Zander said, his small voice steadier now that he had an adult handling the crisis. Some of the panic had left his face, replaced by a kind of desperate hope that someone older and stronger and more capable was finally taking charge. But then after lunch it got worse and he used his inhaler but it was empty and he started making scary sounds and his lips turned blue and he couldn't talk anymore and I got so scared. Harold's jaw tightened as the picture became clearer. Severe asthma attack, probably progressing to respiratory failure if the child's lips were cyanotic. Minutes mattered in situations like this, possibly seconds if the airway had closed completely.
How long has he been like this?
Harold asked, running a red light without hesitation. A delivery truck slammed on its brakes, the driver leaning on his horn, but Harold was already past, already focused on the next intersection. I don't know, Zander said, his voice small and scared again. I was watching cartoons and then I heard him make a weird sound and when I went to check on him he was on the floor and he couldn't breathe and I tried to help him but I didn't know what to do and I called Mama but she won't answer and I got so scared I just started running. Tears were flowing freely down his cheeks now, the adrenaline that had kept him moving starting to wear off as reality set in. He was 7 years old and his brother was dying and he'd done everything he could think of but it might not be enough. Harold reached over and squeezed his shoulder briefly, a gesture of comfort that felt foreign to hands more accustomed to violence than compassion.
You did the right thing, he said firmly.
Running for help was exactly what you should have done. You're very brave, Zander. The boy looked up at him with eyes that wanted desperately to believe, to trust that everything would be okay now that a grown-up was handling things. Harold felt the weight of that trust settle onto his shoulders, heavy and terrifying in its purity. He ran another red light, then another, the Mercedes moving through intersections with aggressive confidence that made other drivers swerve and honk. Zander didn't flinch at the near misses, his entire focus consumed by getting back to his brother before the worst thing imaginable happened. Which building? Harold asked as they entered the 4th block, his eyes scanning the row of decrepit apartment complexes that lined both sides of the street. The yellow one with the broken stairs. Zander pointed to a building that had probably been condemned at least once, its facade crumbling in patterns that suggested structural issues beyond what cosmetic repairs could address. The paint was peeling in long strips, exposing rotting wood underneath. Several windows were boarded up, and the front steps were cracked and sagging in ways that suggested they might collapse under too much weight. Harold pulled up to the curb with tires squealing, the Mercedes looking obscenely out of place in front of a building where residents probably earned in a year what he spent on a single business dinner. He was out of the car before Zander finished unbuckling, his long legs carrying him toward the entrance while the boys scrambled to keep up behind him. 3rd floor, apartment 3C, Zander called, his light-up sneakers flashing as he ran to catch him. It's the one at the end of the hall with the crooked numbers on the door. The building's interior smelled like decades of deferred maintenance and broken dreams. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing layers of previous attempts at decoration stretching back what looked like decades. Water stains spread across the ceiling in abstract patterns that spoke of leaks never properly fixed. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of cooking, beans and rice and something fried, mixed with less pleasant odors that Harold tried not to identify. Harold took the stairs 3 at a time, his expensive suit jacket flapping behind him as he climbed toward the 3rd floor where a child was dying while his mother worked a shift that probably paid barely enough to cover rent on this decaying studio. Zander struggled to keep up, his shorter legs forcing him to take the stairs 2 at a time, but he didn't complain, didn't ask Harold to slow down. The 3rd floor hallway was dimmer than the others, half the overhead lights burned out and never replaced. Harold could hear televisions blaring from behind closed doors, babies crying, people arguing in Spanish and English and sometimes both languages mixed together. The door to 3C stood slightly ajar, the lock broken in a way that suggested it had been that way for months. The brass numbers that should have read 3C were crooked, the C hanging upside down. Harold pushed through into an apartment that measured perhaps 200 square feet, every inch meticulously organized to maximize space that would never be enough. Despite the poverty that defined the space, someone, probably the boy's mother, had tried to make it a home. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, though the paint was old and fading. Curtains hung in the single window, handmade from fabric that looked like it had come from a thrift store but had been carefully hemmed and hung with obvious care. A small bookshelf made from cinder blocks and boards held schoolbooks and library books and a few worn paperbacks. Children's drawings covered one wall, secured with tape that was starting to yellow with age. Mateo lay on a mattress in the corner, his small body impossibly still, his chest barely moving with breaths that whistled with the sound of airways closing. His lips were indeed blue, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Harold recognized from having seen men die in situations where medical intervention came too late or not at all. The boy's eyes were closed, his face peaceful in a way that was more terrifying than any expression of pain would have been. Harold dropped to his knees beside the boy, his expensive pants immediately absorbing moisture from the worn carpet, but he didn't care. His fingers automatically went to Mateo's neck to find a pulse that fluttered weak and too fast beneath skin that burned with fever. The child's eyes were closed, consciousness already slipping away as his brain started shutting down from oxygen deprivation.
Mateo.
Zander's voice cracked as he threw himself down beside his brother, his small hands touching his face with desperate gentleness.
Mateo, I brought help. You have to wake up now.
Please wake up. But Mateo didn't respond, his body focused entirely on the losing battle to breathe. Each breath came with a high-pitched wheeze that Harold recognized as the sound of airways closing, the space through which air could pass getting smaller and smaller with each passing second. Harold pulled out his phone with one hand while his other hand tilted Mateo's head back, opening his airway as much as possible given the circumstances. The position helped slightly. The whistling changed pitch, suggesting marginally more air was getting through. But it wasn't enough. The child needed medical intervention, needed medications, and equipment that Harold couldn't provide. He dialed 911 with efficiency born from having made similar calls before, though never for a child, never in a situation where his own emotional investment threatened to compromise the clinical detachment he needed to handle the emergency effectively. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, probably dealing with her 100th crisis of the day. I need an ambulance at 2847 Southwest 8th Street, Apartment 3C, Harold said when the dispatcher answered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people respond without questioning. 10-year-old male, severe asthma attack, respiratory distress progressing to failure.
Patient is cyanotic and barely conscious.
ETA needs to be under 5 minutes or we're looking at brain damage or death. The dispatcher asked questions he answered with medical precision that probably seemed unusual for a civilian, but Harold didn't care about maintaining his cover story when a child's life hung in the balance. He described Mateo's symptoms with the kind of detail that came from having dealt with trauma in contexts where knowing the difference between critical and merely serious could mean survival or death. Can you see if the patient has an inhaler anywhere nearby? The dispatcher asked. Checking, Harold said, his eyes scanning the immediate area. He spotted the empty inhaler on the floor near the mattress, picked it up and shook it. Completely empty, not even a hiss of remaining medication. Inhaler is present but empty. No medication available.
I'm dispatching an ambulance now. Stay on the line with me.
Is the patient breathing?
Barely.
Respiratory rate is rapid and shallow, approximately 40 breaths per minute. Audible wheeze on both inspiration and expiration.
Lips and nail beds are cyanotic.
Patient is not responding to verbal stimuli. Ambulance is 7 minutes out, the dispatcher said, and Harold felt his stomach drop because 7 minutes was too long when Mateo's breathing was already this compromised. That's not acceptable, Harold said, his voice dropping into the dangerous register he used when people needed to understand that failure wasn't an option. You find a unit that's closer or you tell that ambulance to ignore traffic laws, but you get medical personnel here in under 5 minutes. This child is in respiratory failure and 7 minutes means he'll have permanent brain damage if he survives at all. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the dispatcher probably taken aback by the intensity of his tone. Sir, I understand this is stressful, but… No, Harold interrupted, his voice cold.
You don't understand.
I'm looking at a 10-year-old child whose lips are blue because he can't get enough oxygen. His breathing is getting worse with every second we waste on this conversation. So you're going to get an ambulance here in under 5 minutes, or you're going to explain to this boy's family why you let him die because you were following protocol. Another pause, then the sound of rapid typing. I'm upgrading the priority.
Ambulance ETA now 4 minutes.
Stay with the patient and keep monitoring his breathing. He hung up before the dispatcher could provide more instructions he didn't need, his attention already back on Mateo and Zander. Zander pressed himself against Harold's side, his small body seeking comfort from the only adult present, and he felt him trembling with fear that no 7-year-old should have to experience. His arm went around him automatically, pulling him close while his other hand monitored Mateo's pulse with professional attention to the rhythm and strength that told him more than he wanted to know about how close they were to losing this fight. The boy's pulse was thread, racing at what Harold estimated was close to 150 beats per minute as his heart tried to compensate for the lack of oxygen reaching his tissues. His skin was hot to the touch, fever spiking as his body fought against the inflammation closing his airways. Is he going to die? Zander whispered, the question so small and broken that Harold felt his chest constrict painfully. Harold looked down at the terrified child pressed against his side and made a decision. He could tell Zander the truth, that his brother was in serious danger, that the next few minutes would determine whether Mateo lived or died, that there were no guarantees even if the ambulance arrived in time. That would be honest, but it would also destroy whatever fragile hope was keeping Zander together. Or he could lie, could offer false comfort that might turn to ash if the worst happened, but would give the 7-year-old something to hold onto in what might be the last moments of his brother's life. No, he said, making a promise he had no authority to make but recognizing that this child needed certainty more than honesty in this moment. The ambulance is coming and they are going to help him breathe, and is going to be fine because he's got a brave little brother who ran through traffic to save him. The lie tasted bitter, but Zander's small body relaxed slightly against him, trust given freely despite having every reason to withhold it from a stranger who'd almost killed him with his car. The boy's breathing steadied slightly, the panic that had been making him shake easing just a fraction as he absorbed Harold's words. I ran really fast, Zander said, his voice small but with a hint of pride breaking through the fear. I didn't stop even when I was tired or when my side hurt or when that car almost hit me. Because Mateo would do the same thing for me. He's always taking care of me. Harold felt something shift in his chest, some long-dormant capacity for feeling that he'd thought he'd successfully killed years ago. This child's love for his brother, his willingness to risk everything to save him, cut through every cynical calculation Harold had used to navigate the world for the past 15 years. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Harold monitored Mateo's breathing, noting how each breath came harder than the last, how the whistling sound was fading into an ominous quiet that suggested complete airway closure was imminent. He'd seen men die from less severe trauma, watched life drain from bodies that couldn't sustain the damage they'd endured, but those had been criminals who'd accepted the risks of their profession.
This was a child.
A 10-year-old who should have been playing video games or riding bikes or doing whatever normal kids did on Tuesday afternoons, not lying unconscious on a mattress in an apartment that smelled like poverty and broken systems. Harold found himself studying the apartment more carefully, taking in details he'd missed in the initial rush to reach Mateo. The kitchen area consisted of a hot plate and a mini-fridge, both showing their age. A small table held carefully organized papers, bills, probably, judging by the official-looking envelopes. A calendar on the wall showed someone's work schedule, marked with neat handwriting that indicated long shifts at multiple locations. This family was poor, but they were trying. Someone kept this place clean despite the building's decay. Someone made sure there were books for the children to read. Someone had hung those cheerful yellow curtains and painted those walls and created a space that felt like a home despite having almost nothing. Zander's small voice broke through his observations. Mr. Stranger?
Can you tell me your name?
Because if Mateo wakes up, I want to tell him who saved us. Harold, he said, the name emerging before he could consider the implications of giving this child his real identity. Harold Ranger. Thank you, Mr. Harold, Zander said, pressing himself closer against Harold's side. You're a good man. Mama says you can always tell good people because they help when they don't have to. The simple faith in those words landed like a physical blow.
Harold Ranger was not a good man.
He'd built his fortune on violence and coercion, had ordered actions that had destroyed lives, had spent 15 years being exactly the kind of person that mothers warn their children about. But this 7-year-old had decided he was good, had placed his trust in him based on nothing more than Harold stopping his car when he could have driven away. Sirens finally cut through the Miami afternoon, growing louder as emergency vehicles navigated streets that weren't designed for urgency. Harold heard footsteps pounding up the stairs, voices calling out, and then paramedics were bursting through the door with equipment that transformed the tiny apartment into a medical scene. What's his name? The lead paramedic asked, already kneeling beside Mateo with professional efficiency. He was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of practiced calm that came from dealing with emergencies every day. Mateo Montes, 10 years old, diagnosed asthma, ran out of medication, Harold said, his arm still around Zander as he watched the medical team work with wide eyes that held too much fear for someone so small. Severe attack progressing for approximately 6 hours, lips cyanotic for at least 4 to 5 minutes, consciousness diminishing for past 15. Pulse is thready, rate approximately 150. Respirations are rapid and shallow, approximately 40 per minute with audible wheeze on both inspiration and expiration. The paramedic's eyes flickered to Harold with surprise that he was providing such detailed information, but there wasn't time for questions about how a man in a $3,000 suit happened to be in this apartment with medical knowledge that seemed unusual for a civilian. The second paramedic, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, was already pulling equipment from their bags. They worked with the kind of synchronized efficiency that came from countless emergencies, each knowing what the other needed before words were spoken. They inserted an airway device, a flexible tube that helped hold Mateo's airway open, then started oxygen flowing at rates meant to force his compromised lungs to accept air they'd been refusing. The sound of the oxygen flowing was loud in the small apartment, competing with the continued wheeze of Mateo's breathing. And 4-line appeared in the boy's arm with practiced speed, the female paramedic finding a vein on the first try despite Mateo's small, dehydrated veins. Medication began flowing into his system, steroids to reduce the inflammation, albuterol to open his airways, fluids to combat the dehydration that had made his condition worse. "We need to transport immediately," the lead paramedic said to his partner. "Jackson Memorial has pediatric respiratory specialists on call. I'll call it in on the way." They moved Mateo onto a stretcher with care that suggested they understood how fragile he was, how close to the edge of catastrophic failure. One of them grabbed the stuffed bear that Zander had placed under Mateo's arm earlier, tucking it beside him on the stretcher. Zander started to follow, but one of the paramedics put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Is there a parent or guardian we can contact?" he asked, kindness evident in his voice despite the urgency of the situation. "Our mama is at work," Zander said, tears streaming down his face. "She's a housekeeper at the Fontainebleau and she doesn't know Mateo got sick and I tried to call but she couldn't answer and I don't want him to go to the hospital alone. He'll be scared if he wakes up and nobody's there." The paramedic looked at Harold with question evident in his expression, trying to determine what role this well-dressed stranger played in a family that clearly couldn't afford the car he drove or the watch on his wrist. Harold could see the calculation happening, assessing whether he was family, friend, or something else entirely. "I'll bring him to the hospital," Harold heard himself say, the commitment made before rational thought could intervene with all the reasons why involving himself further was a catastrophic idea. "And I'll make sure we contact his mother immediately." The paramedics exchanged a glance, some wordless communication passing between them. The female paramedic nodded slightly, and her partner accepted Harold's statement with a nod. "We're taking him to Jackson Memorial," the lead paramedic said.
Head straight to the emergency department.
"They'll be expecting you." They were already moving toward the door with Mateo secured to the stretcher, their movements efficient despite the tight space and broken railings. Zander tried to follow again, but Harold caught his hand with gentle firmness. "We need to let them take him in the ambulance so they can keep helping him breathe," he said, crouching down to Zander's eye level despite how his expensive pants would suffer from contact with the apartment's questionable floor. "But I promise we'll follow right behind them and you'll see your brother at the hospital as soon as the doctors say it's okay." Zander's lower lip trembled, but he nodded with a kind of forced bravery that broke something in Harold's chest that he hadn't known could still break. His small hand gripped Harold's tightly, as if afraid that letting go would mean losing the only adult who'd stayed with him through this nightmare. They watched the paramedics carry Mateo down the stairs, their movements efficient despite the tight space and broken railings that made every step precarious. Harold could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their movements, treating their small patient with the kind of careful attention that suggested they knew exactly how serious the situation was. When the sound of their footsteps faded, Harold pulled out his phone, already dialing the Fontainebleau's main number with the kind of authority that expected cooperation. He kept his other hand on Zander's shoulder, a steady presence for the terrified child. "Fontainebleau, Miami Beach. How may I direct your call?" The receptionist's voice was professionally cheerful, utterly oblivious to the crisis Harold was dealing with. "I need to speak with someone in housekeeping management immediately," Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected to be obeyed. "It's a family emergency regarding one of your employees, Maria Montes."
The receptionist hesitated.
"Sir, I'm not authorized to interrupt staff members during their shifts. If you'd like to leave a message." "No," Harold interrupted, his voice dropping into the dangerous register that made people understand they were dealing with someone who wouldn't accept refusal.
"This isn't a message situation.
This is her 10-year-old son just went to the hospital in respiratory failure situation.
So you have two choices.
You connect me to housekeeping management now, or I show up in person and discuss your policy with your general manager while explaining why the Fontainebleau thinks work is more important than a mother knowing her son is dying." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "One moment, please." The hold music was some bland instrumental version of a song Harold didn't recognize. He waited, forcing himself to remain calm despite the urgency thrumming through his veins. Beside him, Zander was crying silently, tears streaming down his face as reality set in. "This is Carla Mendez, housekeeping supervisor." I understand there's an emergency. Maria Montes's son Mateo is being transported to Jackson Memorial Hospital in respiratory failure, Harold said bluntly, seeing no point in softening the message. I need you to find her and tell her immediately. Her younger son and I are heading to the hospital now.
Oh my God, Carla breathed. Maria's on the 10th floor. I'll get her right now.
Jackson Memorial, you said.
Emergency department. Tell her we'll meet her there.
He hung up and looked down at Zander, who was staring up at him with eyes that held too much trust for someone who'd only known him for 20 minutes.
Come on, Harold said gently.
Let's go see your brother. Jackson Memorial Hospital's emergency department pulsed with controlled chaos that felt familiar to Harold in ways he didn't care to examine too closely. He'd been here before under circumstances that required discretion and cash payments to doctors who understood that certain injuries came with questions better left unasked. But walking through those automatic doors with Zander's small hand gripped tightly in his felt entirely different from his previous visits. The child hadn't let go of him since they'd left the apartment, his fingers locked around his with desperate trust that made his chest feel too tight. He'd been silent during the drive, his eyes tracking the ambulance ahead of them through Miami traffic, and Harold had found himself driving with uncharacteristic caution despite his usual aggressive navigation of streets where hesitation meant weakness. The intake coordinator looked up as they approached, her professional smile faltering slightly when she registered the contrast they presented. A man in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a little boy in a worn superhero t-shirt whose light-up sneakers had finally stopped flashing after their batteries died somewhere between the apartment and the hospital. The boy's face was streaked with tears and dirt, his baseball cap askew, his small hand clutching Harold's larger one with desperate strength. I need to check on Mateo Montes, Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made bureaucracy bend. 10-year-old male, severe asthma attack, brought in by ambulance approximately 12 minutes ago. The coordinator's fingers moved across her keyboard, eyes scanning information that appeared on her screen. Harold could see the moment she found the file, her expression shifting to one of professional concern. Are you family? She asked, the question routine but carrying weight in situations where privacy laws intersected with medical emergencies. Harold started, then felt Zander tug on his hand. He's helping us because Mama isn't here yet, Zander said, his small voice steady despite the tears that had dried in tracks down his cheeks. He saved Mateo when I ran out of time to get to the hospital by myself. He drove really fast and called the ambulance and stayed with us even though he doesn't have to. The coordinator's expression softened with understanding that transcended policy questions about legal guardianship and proper protocols. She'd probably seen enough family emergencies to recognize genuine care when she saw it, regardless of whether there was a legal relationship. Mateo is with the pediatric respiratory team, she said, her tone gentler now. They are working on stabilizing him. It's going to be a while before anyone can visit, but I can take you to the pediatric waiting area where you'll be more comfortable. Harold felt Zander's grip tighten on his hand, his small body pressing against his leg with the kind of physical proximity that children used when the world got too scary to face alone. He looked down at his upturned face and saw fear mixed with exhaustion that made him want to destroy whatever systems had put a 10-year-old in a position where running out of asthma medication became a life-threatening crisis. We'll wait, he said, allowing himself to be led through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and the particular kind of anxiety that hospitals cultivated in their architecture and lighting choices. The pediatric waiting area attempted cheerfulness with painted murals of cartoon characters and furniture sized for families dealing with their worst nightmares disguised as medical emergencies. The walls were decorated with underwater scenes, smiling fish and friendly dolphins and coral reefs that sparkled with improbable colors. The chairs were small and brightly colored, designed for children and their parents, not for a 6'2" criminal who'd never spent time in spaces designed for families. Harold lowered himself into a chair that was too small for his frame, and Zander immediately climbed into his lap with the automatic trust of a child who'd decided he was safe despite all evidence suggesting that strangers and expensive cars were exactly the kind of danger his mother probably warned him about. He should have been uncomfortable. Should have maintained the distance that his position in Miami's criminal hierarchy required, the separation between his world and anything resembling normal human connection. But Zander's small body fit against his chest with surprising naturalness, and his hair smelled like cheap shampoo and childhood innocence, and Harold found himself stroking his back with gentleness that came from somewhere he'd thought had died years ago in circumstances he rarely allowed himself to remember. The waiting room held other families, other crises. A woman in her 60s sat in the corner, her hands wrapped around a rosary, lips moving in silent prayer. A young couple held each other, their faces etched with the kind of fear that came from watching their child suffer. A teenager sat alone, his leg in a temporary splint, probably waiting for X-rays. "Tell me about your brother," Harold said quietly, needing to distract Zander from watching the emergency department doors with intensity that suggested he was trying to will Mateo back to health through pure force of concentration. Zander's voice emerged small but steady as he began describing his brother. How Mateo helped him with homework even when his breathing was bad, would sit with him for hours working through math problems that didn't make sense until Mateo explained them in ways their teachers never did. How he shared his food when their mother's paycheck stretched too thin at the end of the month, always making sure Zander ate first even if it meant Mateo went hungry. How he taught him to tie his shoes using a story about a rabbit running around a tree and jumping through a hole, making it fun instead of frustrating. How Mateo told him stories about their father, a man Zander barely remembered but who Mateo described with details that might have been real or might have been the kind of mythology children created to fill absences that hurt too much to face honestly. "He says Dad was a hero," Zander said, his voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a secret. "That he had to go away to do important work but that he loved us very much. Mama gets sad when we talk about him, so mostly Mateo just tells me stories when it's just us." Harold listened with attention he rarely gave to anyone's words, noting how Zander's description painted a picture of a child who'd been forced into adult responsibilities far too early. A 10-year-old who protected his little brother and helped his mother and suffered from a chronic illness that should have been manageable with consistent medical care but had become life-threatening because poverty turned treatable conditions into catastrophes. "Mateo wants to be a doctor when he grows up," Zander continued, warming to his subject now that he had an attentive audience. "He says he wants to help kids like him who can't always afford medicine. He reads medical books from the library and everything. He knows all the names of different medicines and what they do." The ambition was touching and heartbreaking in equal measure. A child who'd experienced the healthcare system's failures firsthand, dreaming of fixing it for others while his own family struggled to afford basic treatments. His phone buzzed with messages from associates wondering where he'd disappeared to, questions about meetings he'd missed and decisions that required his input. Harold ignored them all, choosing instead to focus on the child in his arms who'd somehow become more important than the empire he'd spent 15 years building. One message in particular caught his attention. Victor Vega wanting to know where he was, why he'd missed their 2 o'clock meeting. Harold could feel the weight of that message, the implications of ignoring someone as powerful as Victor. But looking down at Zander's small, trusting face, Harold found that he didn't care about the potential consequences. Let Victor wait. Let them all wait. Maria Montes arrived 43 minutes later, bursting through the waiting area doors with the kind of panic that came from receiving a phone call about your son dying while you were cleaning toilets for people who wouldn't remember your name if asked. She was younger than Harold expected, probably only 28 or 29, with features that would have been pretty if exhaustion and worry hadn't carved lines that aged her beyond her years. She still wore her housekeeping uniform, a simple blue dress with the Fontainebleau logo embroidered on the pocket. Her hands were red and chapped from years of cleaning chemicals, and her shoes were the practical kind worn by people who spent their days on their feet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and sweat dampened her forehead from what must have been a frantic rush to get here. "Zander." Maria's voice cracked as she saw her son, and Zander launched himself from Harold's lap with desperate relief. Mother and son came together in an embrace that made Harold feel like an intruder on something too intimate for strangers to witness. Maria's hands moved over Zander's body with the kind of assessment mothers perfected through years of checking for injuries and illnesses that children sometimes hid because they didn't want to worry adults who already carried too much. "Estás bien? Te lastimast?" Maria's questions tumbled out in rapid Spanish, fear making her revert to her first language despite years of forcing herself to speak English in workplaces where accents meant judgment and potential job loss. "I'm okay, Mama," Zander said, his own tears starting fresh now that his mother was here to catch them. "But Mateo stopped breathing and I ran to get help and this man brought me here and the doctors are helping Mateo breathe again but I was so scared. He turned blue, Mama. His lips were blue and he couldn't talk and I thought. He couldn't finish the sentence, the words dissolving into sobs as the full weight of what had happened finally crashed over him. Maria held him tighter, her own tears falling into his hair as she rocked him back and forth, murmuring comfort in Spanish that Harold didn't need to translate to understand. After a long moment, Maria's eyes found Harold's for the first time, taking in his expensive suit and the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than she earned in 6 months. Her expression shifted through confusion to suspicion to reluctant gratitude as she tried to understand what role this obviously wealthy stranger had played in her children's crisis. "Thank you," she said, the words careful and measured as she tried to determine what debt she might have just incurred.
For helping my son. For bringing him here. I don't understand how.
Your son ran into traffic trying to reach the hospital, Harold said, standing and closing the distance between them with slow movements that wouldn't startle.
He literally ran in front of my car.
When he told me his brother couldn't breathe, I drove him back to your apartment and called the ambulance. The paramedics took Mateo about 4 to 5 minutes ago. The respiratory team is working on him now. Maria's face went through several expressions as she processed this information: horror at Zander running into traffic, guilt that she hadn't been reachable when her children needed her, fear about Mateo's condition, and something else that looked dangerously close to the kind of desperation that came from understanding you owed someone more than you could ever repay. I need to see my son, she said, turning toward the emergency department doors with determination that suggested she'd fight through security if necessary. They'll come get you when he's stable enough for visitors, Harold said, recognizing the need to intervene before Maria created a scene that would only delay her access to Mateo. Trust me, disrupting their work won't help him. He's getting the best care possible right now. Maria turned back with eyes that held too much pain, too much accumulated trauma from years of fighting battles she couldn't win. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. I wasn't there when he needed me. I was scrubbing toilets while my baby couldn't breathe. What kind of mother? The kind who works 16-hour shifts to keep a roof over her children's heads, Harold interrupted, his tone firmer than he'd intended but needing to stop the spiral of self-blame that wouldn't help anyone. The kind whose son is brave enough to run through traffic because you taught him that family is worth any risk. You didn't fail your son. The system failed him by making asthma medication too expensive for people who work as hard as you do. The words emerged with more passion than Harold usually allowed himself, and he saw Maria's eyes widen with surprise that this wealthy stranger seemed to understand the mathematics of poverty in ways that suggested personal experience rather than academic knowledge. Before Maria could respond, a doctor emerged from the emergency department doors, her scrubs decorated with cartoon characters that matched the waiting room's attempted cheerfulness. Dr. Sarah Chen was in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm competence that inspired confidence. Her expression carried the careful neutrality medical professionals used when delivering news that required delicate handling. Mrs. Montes, the doctor asked, and Maria nodded with body language that braced for impact. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I've been treating your son Mateo. He's stable now and breathing on his own with supplemental oxygen, but he gave us quite a scare. His airway was significantly compromised when he arrived, and we had to provide aggressive intervention to prevent respiratory failure. Maria's legs seemed to give out, and Harold found himself catching her elbow with support that kept her upright despite the weight of relief and delayed terror hitting simultaneously. Zander pressed against her other side, small hands gripping Maria's work uniform with desperate need for physical contact. Can I see him? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In a few minutes, Dr. Chen said with compassion that suggested she understood how those minutes would feel like hours. We're moving him to the pediatric intensive care unit where he'll be monitored closely for the next 24 hours. He'll need to stay hospitalized for at least 3 days while we adjust his medication regimen and ensure his breathing stabilizes completely. Harold watched Maria's face as she processed this information, saw the moment when the relief about Mateo's survival collided with the reality of medical bills she couldn't possibly afford. 3 days in a hospital where each hour probably cost more than she earned in a week, medications that would require insurance she likely didn't have or deductibles she couldn't meet, follow-up care that would stretch her already impossible budget past any breaking point. Whatever the cost, it's covered, Harold heard himself say, the commitment made before rational thought could intervene with warnings about exposure and complications. All of it. Hospital stay, medications, follow-up care. I'll handle the billing directly. Maria's head snapped toward him with shock that quickly transformed into the same suspicious pride he'd seen in countless faces before. I can't accept that, she said immediately, her spine straightening despite exhaustion that had her swaying on her feet. I don't know you. I don't know what you'd expect in return. I appreciate what you did for my children, but I'm not someone's charity case. The steel in her voice commanded respect despite circumstances that should have made her powerless. Harold recognized the need for dignity even in moments of complete vulnerability, understood that pride was often the only thing people had left when everything else had been stripped away by systems designed to keep them struggling. What if it wasn't charity? Harold asked, his mind already formulating a plan that straddled the line between legitimate help and the kind of manipulation he'd spent years perfecting in very different contexts. I own several businesses in Miami. One of them is a property management company that handles luxury residential buildings. We're always looking for good people to manage operations, coordinate staff, ensure tenant satisfaction. It's a real job with real responsibilities and a salary that would allow you to afford your son's medical care. Maria's eyes narrowed with a kind of suspicion that came from years of dealing with offers that seemed too good to be true because they always were. Jobs don't just appear for housekeepers who miss work when their sons can't breathe, she said, but Harold could hear the hope beneath the skepticism, could see her weighing pride against pragmatism in calculations she'd probably been making her entire adult life. This one does, Harold said, pulling a business card from his wallet with contact information for one of his legitimate enterprises. Call this number tomorrow and ask for Catherine in Human Resources.
She'll be expecting you.
The position starts at $70,000 annually with full benefits including health insurance that will cover both your children. The figure hung in the air between them, simultaneously life-changing and suspicious in its generosity. Maria stared at the card like it might explode, like accepting it would bind her to obligations she couldn't anticipate or escape. Why would you do this? She asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that men with money didn't help women like her without expecting something that would cost more than gratitude. Why would someone like you care what happens to people like us? Harold met her eyes directly, letting her see whatever she needed to see to trust him despite having every reason not to. Because your son ran in front of my car asking for help, and I'm tired of living in a world where brave children have to risk their lives because the adults around them have failed to create systems that protect the vulnerable. Consider it penance or privilege or whatever makes you comfortable accepting it, but please don't let pride prevent you from giving your children the stability they deserve. Dr. Chen had been watching this exchange with interest that suggested she'd witnessed similar moments before, wealthy benefactors appearing in hospital waiting rooms with offers that seemed too generous to be innocent. But she cleared her throat gently, reminding them that Mateo was waiting. Mrs. Montes, if you'd like to see your son now, I can take you back, she said. Maria looked between the doctor, Harold, and the business card in her hand with expression that showed her entire world shifting beneath her feet. Come with me, she said to Zander, reaching for her son's hand. But Zander had already moved back to Harold's side, his small hand finding his with automatic trust that made Maria's eyes widen. Can he come too? Zander asked, looking up at Harold with hope that felt impossibly heavy. I want Mateo to meet the man who saved us. I don't think, Harold started, recognizing that inserting himself further into this family's crisis was dangerous for reasons that had nothing to do with hospital policy and everything to do with how completely these strangers were dismantling the walls he'd built between himself and anything resembling emotional connection. Please, Zander said, the single word carrying more weight than entire speeches could have managed. Harold looked at Maria, seeing her conflicted expression as she tried to understand what was happening, why her son had attached himself to this stranger with a kind of trust that usually took weeks to develop. But Maria nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing that arguing with Zander's assessment of safety would only create more trauma in a day that had already contained too much. They followed Dr. Chen through corridors that smelled of industrial cleaning products and the particular kind of fear that hospitals cultivated in their very architecture. The pediatric intensive care unit existed behind double doors that required security clearance, and a nurse buzzed them through after confirming their identities and relationship to the patient. Mateo lay in a bed that seemed designed to emphasize how small he was, surrounded by monitors that tracked his vital signs with digital precision. An oxygen cannula ran beneath his nose, supplementing breaths that came easier now but still carried traces of the wheeze that had nearly killed him. His eyes were closed, sedation keeping him comfortable while his body recovered from hours of fighting for air. The stuffed bear Zander had tucked under his arm was still there, positioned carefully by one of the paramedics who'd understood that such things mattered to children. Maria moved to the bedside with a kind of desperate grace that mothers perfected when their children were hurt, her hand finding Mateo's with touch that was simultaneously gentle and fierce. Tears streamed down her face as she took in the 4 lines and monitoring equipment, visual proof of how close she'd come to losing her son while she was miles away scrubbing floors for people who wouldn't remember her name. "Mi amor," she whispered, her voice breaking on the endearment.
"Mama's here now.
You're safe. You're going to be okay." Harold stood near the door with Zander beside him, feeling like an intruder on a moment that should have been private. But Zander tugged on his hand, pulling him closer to the bed with determination that suggested he needed him to see his brother, needed Mateo to know who'd helped them even if the boy was too sedated to process the information. "That's him," Zander said softly, pride evident in his voice despite the circumstances. "That's my brother Mateo. He's really smart and he helps me with everything and he's going to be okay now because you brought us to the hospital in time. Mateo's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his brother's voice, focus gradually sharpening as he registered the unfamiliar room and the adults surrounding his bed. His gaze found his mother first, relief flooding his young face, then moved to Zander with the kind of protective assessment that suggested he was checking to ensure he was unharmed despite him being the one in the hospital bed. Zander ran to find help when you stopped breathing, Maria explained gently, stroking her son's forehead with maternal tenderness.
He was very brave.
And this man, Mr. She paused, realizing she'd never actually learned Harold's name despite everything that had happened. Harold Ranger, he supplied, feeling the weight of offering his real name rather than one of the various aliases he used in contexts where anonymity provided protection. Mr. Ranger brought him here and made sure you got help in time, Maria finished, her eyes meeting Harold's with gratitude that felt uncomfortable in its intensity. Mateo's gaze found Harold's, intelligence evident despite the exhaustion shadowing his young face. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough from intubation and hours of labored breathing.
For helping my brother. For calling the ambulance. For staying with them.
The simple gratitude shouldn't have affected Harold the way it did, but something about this 10-year-old's earnest appreciation cut through defenses that violent men and dangerous situations had never managed to penetrate. He found himself moving closer to the bed, aware that he was crossing boundaries he'd never approached before but unable to stop the momentum that had been building since Zander had pounded on his car window. Your brother is very brave, Harold said, his hand resting briefly on Mateo's shoulder with touch that conveyed more than words could manage. He ran through traffic and didn't give up even when he was scared. You're lucky to have him. I know, Mateo said, his eyes finding Zander with sibling love that was pure and uncomplicated. He's the best brother anyone could have. A nurse entered to check Mateo's vitals, her presence a reminder that this was a hospital room rather than a family reunion, and Harold recognized the need to give them space for recovery that didn't include strangers who'd played their role and should now exit gracefully. I should go, he said, looking at Maria with expression that tried to communicate his sincerity about the job offer without pressuring her.
Call that number tomorrow.
The position is real, and Catherine will have all the details you need to make an informed decision. But Zander's hand tightened on his with surprising strength, his small face turning up toward him with panic that suggested his leaving felt like abandonment. You're not going to disappear, are you? He asked, the question revealing depths of anxiety about adults who helped and then vanished that spoke to experiences Harold didn't want to contemplate too closely. I'm not disappearing, Harold heard himself promise, making commitments he should have avoided but finding himself unable to deny this child's need for reassurance. I'll make sure your mother has my contact information, and you can call if you need anything. I promise. Maria watched this exchange with expression that suggested she was re-evaluating her initial assumptions about Harold's motivations, seeing how her son had somehow decided the stranger was safe despite every warning she'd probably given about trusting people who seemed too generous. Dr. Chen returned with update about Mateo's treatment plan, and Harold used the interruption to extract himself from the room with final glance at the small family that had somehow become his responsibility without any formal agreement or legal standing. He made it to his car in the hospital parking garage before the full weight of what he'd committed himself to settled across his shoulders like physical burden. He'd just inserted himself into the lives of strangers who had no idea that his wealth came from operations that made him exactly the kind of danger they should be protected from rather than exposed to. His phone showed 37 missed calls and texts that ranged from concerned to annoyed to threatening depending on who was trying to reach him. Harold scrolled through messages from associates wondering where he'd vanished to, questions about shipments and meetings and decisions that couldn't be delayed without consequences. But sitting in his Mercedes in a hospital parking garage, Harold found he didn't care about any of it. Didn't care about the empire he'd built or the reputation he'd cultivated or the carefully maintained relationships that kept him powerful and feared in Miami's criminal underworld. All he cared about was a 7-year-old boy with light-up sneakers who'd run through traffic to save his brother, and the promise he'd made not to disappear from their lives. The reckoning he'd been avoiding was finally coming, and Harold Ranger would have to choose between the man he'd been and the man a child named Zander Montes believed him to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up.
Just click and check them out.
And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.